Hello, everyone. Right, so welcome to your week 4 revision activity. This one is going to be based on USA, the bust period, so American society during the Great Depression. Just as before, what you'll need is this worksheet, which includes a few questions on this period of history, as well as a GCSE style exam question. This one is an interpretations question, which so you've got the two fours of how does interpretation A differ, why do they differ, and which one is more accurate. And for this one, there's also included some sentence starters to help you figure out the best way to approach answering that question. To help you complete it, you'll obviously need this worksheet that you should get from your teachers, as well as the revision guide, these pages that you should get from your teachers as well. So basically, in a moment, I'm going to sort of talk through a completed version of this worksheet that I've done. But what you want to do now is pause the video, go away, have a go at completing it yourself, and then come back and we'll discuss a completed version. Okay, great. So this is the one I did earlier. So we'll just start going through these questions together now. So the first one, the Depression. Describe what happened on the stock market in October 1929, which led to the Great Depression. So what I put for this one was 13 million shares were sold in a single day, causing share prices in nearly all companies to drop dramatically. Some investors called this Black Thursday, while others simply called it the crash. So this is the Wall Street crash event where the stock markets all plummeted on a single day. That's what caused the Great Depression. So the next question. By 1932, around 30 million people had lost their job, 25% of the workforce. Describe what happened to many of those worst affected by the Depression using at least two key words. So the two key words I put here are overproducing and underconsumption. There are other key words you could potentially use, but I've written American factories were still overproducing goods for a market that could no longer afford them. This was called underconsumption. This caused the factories to have to cut back and lay off workers. Ordinary people lost their savings when the banks failed, with many left unable to pay their rent and faced homelessness. So this is this idea where the factories were still producing in the way that they were during the economic boom, but the American consumer was not consuming enough goods for them to make back the money on those goods, so they had to lay off workers. Why were farmers so badly affected in the 1930s? Refer to at least two reasons. I've got three here that you could potentially use. So there's many farmers had loans from the bank to buy back new equipment, but when the banks ran into trouble after the crash, they demanded their money back. So they were foreclosed upon. With less money coming in from farmers, they couldn't pay their debts and risked losing their farms and had to sack their workers. Sharecroppers didn't own the land in the first place. And mechanized over-farming, also known as deep ploughing, from the late 19th century, had led soil in the Midwest to become thin and lacking in nutrients. In the 1930s, droughts created choking dust storms. This is referred to as the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families who were unable to pay mortgages or grow crops to abandon their farms. The losses reached 25 million per day in 1936. Many of these Okies, or people from Oklahoma, were forced to migrate west to look for new land. So this Dust Bowl was kind of the land that they were farming on became unusable because of this. So the farmers, already struggling from the Great Depression, were unable to even grow anything on their farms. All right, so that's the section on the Depression. We'll move on now to the 1932 election, which is one of the big political consequences of the Great Depression. It was fought between these two men, Herbert Hoover and FDR, or Franklin D. Roosevelt. The first question just simply asks you which party they were both in. Hoover was a Republican and Roosevelt was a Democrat. Typically, if you want to help you out in remembering which one is which, the Democrats are normally the people that are more keen to have more government involvement in the economy, do more different things to try and help improve people's lives, whereas Republicans more in favor of the laissez-faire economics, where they just want to leave it alone under the assumption that the economy will work itself out if it's allowed to kind of get on with things to its own devices. Name one thing that Hoover tried to do to deal with the Depression. So I've got three, as you did have as an example here, because despite being a Republican, he did do some things. So he cut taxes so people have more money to spend, so to try and stimulate the economy in that way. Set up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to businesses, and set up a huge road and dam building projects to create jobs. The Hoover Dam, which you may have heard of, was an example of this. And then explain why Roosevelt won the 1932 election in a landslide. So he won the election, and he did so by making lots of very appealing and ambitious promises to fix the economy as part of his New Deal. Whereas Hoover favored rugged individualism and believed the economy would fix itself, which many Americans were not prepared to wait for any longer. Right, so the New Deal. What were each of the following with reference to Roosevelt's New Deal? So now we're starting to look at specifically some of the policies of the New Deal that Roosevelt put into place once he became president. So we've got 100 days. So he went straight to work in the first 100 days of his presidency, implementing several policies that had an immediate impact on the economy. And this is a case with lots of presidents where you kind of think about the first 100 days of their presidency, and that's when they really get to work and put into place several of the policies that they're really keen on, and that they use the political capital they have from that election. And one example of the policies he put into place in his first 100 days was the Emergency Banking Act. And this is when they closed all the banks for a 4-day bank holiday, where they were inspected, with only honest, well-run banks allowed to reopen. So the idea here was to rebuild people's trust in the banks by inspecting them and closing all the banks that weren't trustworthy. The 3 R's. So these are the 3 key campaign promises that Roosevelt promised to achieve, and that's relief, which is help for the old, the sick, and the unemployed. So provide them with relief from their struggles in the Great Depression. Recovery, and that referred to schemes to provide jobs. And reform. So reform the economy so the Depression doesn't happen again. So once we've fixed the problem, we're now going to fix what caused the problem so we don't have it happen again. And then alphabet agencies. So these were new organizations that were so named because they were known by their initials. For example, the FCA. The FDR's government set up to help different people, such as farmers, workers, and the unemployed. Right, you're then asked to describe 2 of the alphabet agencies, and I've given you 4 examples here. There's lots of examples you could use, but I've just got 4 here. So the FCA, and they lent money to farmers. The NRA gave workers the right to join unions and encouraged employers to work out fairer conditions for their employees. The CCC employed 18 to 25-year-olds to plant trees, dig canals, and clear footpaths, and they created 2.5 million jobs by doing this. And the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, which paid farmers to destroy livestock to restore the price of agriculture. So essentially, they would kill certain animals so that there was a smaller market, and you could get that from them. Right. What was the Wagner Act and why was it significant? Put into place, the NRA was declared illegal by the Supreme Court. It guarantees the right of employees to organise into trade unions and take collective action such as strikes. It also set up systems to punish employers who attempted to stop them from doing so. The Act contributed to a tremendous growth of membership in the labour unions, especially in the mass production sector. The total number of labour unions grew from 3 million in 1933 to 8 million at the end of the 1930s. So this was essentially an act that was put into place to give workers the right and the ability to effectively organise into unions and campaign for better working situations, better pay. So he wanted to improve the lives of workers by giving them a better opportunity to bargain for their own employment rights. Right, and then our last section on this one is how effective was the New Deal? So we've looked at what the New Deal was, but how effective was it in actually doing so? So why did some groups, such as businessmen and Republicans, oppose the New Deal? And these are, well, there's some people who believed it interfered too much with the lives of ordinary Americans. And this is the businessmen and Republicans would fall into these categories, because they very much believed in rugged individualism, and they felt that any effort of the government to interfere in people's lives was not only ineffective, but morally wrong to do so. But then there were other people like Huey Long and his supporters, who were known as Longites, who were even more radical, that felt that the government wasn't doing enough to help the people, and then they needed to act more decisively to fix this situation. And then after that, quite simply, you've just got to highlight the positives and the negatives about the New Deal. So I'll just give you a minute to compare your answers to what I have on here. All right, and finally, overall, was the New Deal a success in your view? I haven't done this one for you because I can't really decide for you whether you think the New Deal was a success. You need to look at the evidence and think, well, how effective was Roosevelt in achieving his goals? Did he provide relief for the sick and the unemployed? Did he provide jobs? Did he help the economy recover? And I think with those two, maybe you do think that because there's certainly evidence, but perhaps you might think reform, maybe not so much, because we can see here unemployment went back up to 10.5 million. That one's really up to you, and you have to look at the evidence yourself and make a judgment on how effective it was. Right, so now let's get to our exam question. So this is an interpretation question where you have to look at these two interpretations and answer the question. So we'll just go through them one by one. Hopefully you will have already read the interpretation, so I'm not going to do that for you again. So we'll start with, how does interpretation A differ from interpretation B? Now this one, very simply, it just wants you to basically say what interpretation A says and how that's different to what interpretation B says. To help you out, a good way to start is to highlight two key phrases which tell you your view. So the ones I've gone with in interpretation A is, all I can say is from where I'm standing, things are better now. And all the president is trying to do is pull the United States out of a rut. And then for interpretation B, I've gone with, it meant absolutely nothing except higher taxation. And he obviously didn't help the poverty situation in this country. So there is, those are the two key statements that I've picked out, and I've kind of translated that into using these sentence starters. And you can see where I've got it in blue. That's where I've added my bits. So I've put here, interpretation A views the New Deal as trying to help people by giving them opportunities. And then I've backed it up with a quote taken directly from the interpretation. I've then done the same with interpretation B in contrasting it. So if this one says that they're trying to help people by giving them opportunities, interpretation B says the New Deal did nothing to help. And then I've also backed that up with a quote from the interpretation. And then I need to do a second one, because for this question you need to have two contrasting views, so 2 points from each interpretation. So I've gone, the New Deal was trying to pull America out of a rut, and then I've backed that up with a quote. I've contrasted that with, it did not improve the American economy, and then I've backed that up with a quote. So giving opportunities, not helping people, improving the economy, not improving the economy. Right, so now we'll move on to why the authors of the interpretations might have different views. And this one's a little bit trickier. What you need to do for this one is have a look primarily at this bit, the description. So what it suggests you do to help you out is highlight the author, what type of person they are, when they wrote, and where. So if we highlight the key bits of information that kind of let us know what kind of person each of these authors are. In this one, it's a trained designer who was writing in 1939. They'd lost their job during the Great Depression, but got work with one of the alphabet agencies, the Works Progress Administration, that paid artists to create murals and do art for the government. And he was writing in Massachusetts. And this one is a man from a wealthy American family in Manhattan, which is one of the wealthiest areas in New York, even during the Depression. And he was writing in the 1960s, so he's writing retrospectively after the fact. So how would that translate onto a question like this? So I've put here that the author of interpretation A may have this interpretation because they were a designer who had lost their job during the Depression, but got work with the WPA, which meant that during the New Deal, they were one of the people who benefited directly from the New Deal's job creation programs. They viewed the New Deal as a positive, and they certainly do. We talked about that in the last question, because it improved their life by helping them find work. So that's kind of one point, these first 3 lines here. And then there's an additional point. Furthermore, they were writing in 1939. This will influence them because they would still be feeling the positive effects of gaining employment. So we've got that they were one of the people that had their lives improved by the Depression, and because they're writing at that time, they are still feeling those effects. They are still benefiting from the New Deal programs that gave them a job. And then for interpretation B, I've done essentially the same thing. So unlike interpretation A, interpretation B is written by a man from a wealthy American family, which meant that their experience of the New Deal was an increase in taxes, but no direct impact on their life. Because if they're already wealthy, the New Deal programs didn't do as much to help them because they didn't need a job. They were doing okay. So for them, the main difference in their life was an increase in taxes. They viewed the New Deal as a negative because they had to pay more taxes but received none of the benefits of the schemes those taxes paid for. And then on my second point is they were writing in 1960. So for this question, I've chosen to contrast directly when it was written. You don't have to do that, but that's one thing you can look for. This will influence them because the economy had recovered during World War II and boomed during the rise of consumerism in the 1950s. So this may be neglecting how bad of the situation was before the Great Depression. So for this one, you can see here, much as I've done with the first one, I've come up with 2 points for each interpretation, and I've kind of contrasted them. I've done what kind of person they were and when it was written for this question, but depending on the question and what you want to do, you might focus on where it was written, you might focus on what their motivation was for writing that interpretation. Maybe they were writing to persuade, what the other person's writing to inform. So that's our clear interpretations. That's our clear attribution of the interpretations. Right, and then our last one, and this is the 8 marker. So the first thing you want to make note of is you should be spending more time on this one than the first 2, because this one's worth 8 marks. And this one is, which one do you find most convincing about FDR's New Deal? And what we do is we encourage you to think about it more as accuracy. Which one is more accurate? because you're a historian, you've done loads of revision and you know loads of historical facts, so you don't need to be convinced. You need to know which one's accurate compared to your historical knowledge. So again, there are sentence starters to help you here. So what you want to do for this one is you want to start by saying, coming up with a statement about something the interpretation says. And you can take these, if you'd like, directly from your first question where you've already decided. So interpretation A in some ways is convincing when it says FDR's New Deal did try to help people by giving them opportunities. Because from 1933, FDR created the alphabet agencies to deal with unemployment. 2.5 million people were employed by the CCC alone. So what I've done there is I've backed it up with a specific, as I can, piece of evidence. The more specific and the more detailed, the better. So here I've got a date when the alphabet agencies were created, and I've got that 2.5 million people were employed in the CCC alone. And then I've got another point here. So furthermore, it's convincing when it says FDR pulled America out of a rut. So I've directly quoted the interpretation there. And because when he became president in 1933, unemployment was 25%, and this lessens to 14% by 1937, showing that the alphabet agencies were working. The GNP, that should say GDP, my apologies, so that's gross domestic product, also went up during the 1930s. However, it is not fully convincing when it claims that things were better by 1939. So you don't have to do this, but if you think you can point out where something is less convincing. Because when it says things were better by 1939, in actual fact, 1 in 10 people were still unemployed, with unemployment still at 19% by 1939, and many farmers continued to live in extreme poverty. So there I've got 3 points of how the taken from the interpretation, and for 2 of them I've supported and said yes, that is accurate, and I've used specific evidence. And then for a 3rd one I've said how what they've said is not accurate, and I've supported that with evidence. And then you can see here I've essentially done the exact same thing with interpretation B, and I'll just read this out for you. So interpretation B in some ways is in some ways convincing, as it is in some as it's. So my apologies. As it says that it raised taxation, because in 1936, Roosevelt himself became worried about how much the job creation schemes like the TVA were costing, so he cut down the amount of money that they were spending on them. So it was costing a lot of money, and Roosevelt had to cut it back. Furthermore, it's convincing when it says the New Deal didn't help the poverty situation in this country, because despite creating jobs, unemployment never dropped below 10% throughout the 1930s, and America remained a country where millions remained poor. And then I've got another statement. However, it's not fully convincing, so another counterpoint. It meant absolutely nothing, when in actual fact the SSA set up America's first system of social welfare, setting up pensions for the elderly and payments for the sick and unemployed. So even those out of work could still receive help from the government. So it says that it meant absolutely nothing for the poverty situation, when in actual fact we can clearly see from the SSA that it did do quite a lot to help the poverty situation in the country, even if it didn't fix it entirely. So that's the main meat of what you need to do for this question. And then the last thing you'd want to do to kind of get into the very top marks for this question is just to make a judgment, which one is more convincing and why. Okay, so that's everything for this question. So hopefully that helps you a little bit with this section, the American society during the Great Depression. Hopefully most of your answers were already right anyway. And you're now ready to move on to your next topic next week. Awesome. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.